Hey there! Today we'll be looking at stories where couples faced dangerous animals. From a tent zipper that opened at the exact wrong second to reveal 700 pounds of hungry grizzly on the other side, to a branch on a hiking trail that turned out to be one of the most quietly lethal snakes in Africa. But first, let's talk about a young couple who ignored a direct warning from the fishermen who worked that creek every single day. It was August 17th, 2021, and Northern Australia sat under the thick, wet heat that never really breaks in that part of the country, even outside the true wet season. The air along the tidal creek was heavy with humidity, the mangroves pressed close on both banks, and the water moved slow and brown, hiding everything beneath its surface the way it always does out there. Locals in the area rarely swam past the first bend of that creek, even on the hottest days, and for good reason. The tidal flow there carried salt water more than a mile inland, which is exactly the kind of brackish, slow-moving system saltwater crocodiles favor for both hunting and raising young. Riker Sloan, 27 years old, worked as a freelance videographer, picking up small commercial gigs between the outdoor content he actually cared about. He'd grown up camping with his father across Queensland and always described himself as someone who felt more comfortable outdoors than in any office. Danny Mercer, 25, worked as a tattoo artist by day and had been building a following online, chasing exactly the kind of adrenaline-driven content Riker specialized in filming. She was the more outspoken of the two, the one who pitched most of their ideas, while Riker handled the technical side and the editing afterward. They'd been dating for a little over a year by the time of the trip, and friends of theirs later described them as inseparable, constantly bouncing content ideas off each other, always looking for the next thing that would set them apart from other creators doing similar stuff. Neither had any formal experience handling wildlife. What they had was a plan, cooked up after watching other people online keep exotic reptiles as pets, catch a juvenile saltwater crocodile, raise it, film the whole process from start to finish for their following. It's worth sitting with how casually that plan came together. This wasn't a licensed reptile rescue or an accredited handler with proper permits. It was two people who liked the idea of the content it would generate, working entirely off videos they'd watched rather than anything resembling formal training. I think that the gap between "I've seen this done" and "I know how to do this" is exactly where a lot of these stories start, and this one is no exception. Neither of them had ever so much as handled a captive crocodile in a controlled setting, let alone attempted to catch a wild one along an unfamiliar stretch of tidal creek. Fishermen along the creek had already told them what was in that water. Big adults, more than one, moving through the same channels the juveniles used to rest and hunt small fish near the banks. Riker and Danny heard that firsthand, from people who fished that creek for a living, and decided a smaller crocodile would mean a smaller risk. One fisherman later told investigators he'd specifically pointed out a stretch of bank where he'd seen a large adult sunning itself just days before, and that Riker had thanked him for the tip and asked which direction the smaller crocodiles tended to favor instead. I don't think that logic holds up under even the loosest scrutiny. A juvenile crocodile doesn't exist in isolation from the adults that share its territory, and anyone who fishes that water for a living would know that without needing to explain it twice. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators by nature. They don't announce themselves before they move, and they don't distinguish cleanly between a threat and an opportunity. Splashing and disturbance in their territory reads as one or the other, and the response tends to be immediate either way. Adult saltwater crocodiles regularly exceed 1,000 pounds and 14 feet in length, and despite that size, they can close distance through water in a fraction of a second once something triggers the strike. On the afternoon of August 17th, they spotted a juvenile resting near the mangrove shoreline. Riker waded into the shallow water carrying a homemade catch pole, while Danny moved farther down the bank to cut off the juvenile's escape route back into deeper water. The moment he reached toward the juvenile with the pole, the water beside him erupted. A hidden adult crocodile clamped down across his midsection and immediately rolled, the classic death roll motion that disorients prey and tears tissue in the same movement. Danny heard him go under and rushed into the water, trying to grab his arm and pull him free. Within seconds, a second adult crocodile surged out from a separate section of the creek and seized her by the leg, dragging her backward into deeper water before she could get any real footing on the muddy bottom. I keep coming back to the fact that they were warned directly by people who actually knew that creek and went ahead with the plan anyway. That's the part that sits wrong with me more than anything else in this story, not the ambition to try something unconventional, but the willingness to override a first-hand warning because the plan felt manageable once it existed on paper. Search crews recovered both bodies downstream over the following 2 days, using boats and, eventually, a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging once the search extended into a second night. One creek held 2 adult crocodiles waiting beneath the surface that gave away nothing. The next story doesn't involve water at all, just a tent, a bear that was never actually hunting people, and a zipper that opened at the exact wrong second. It was September 29th, 2018, and western Montana had already tipped into the cold, gold edge of autumn, the kind of season where the valleys fill with the smell of dying vegetation, and every grizzly bear in the region is thinking about one thing almost exclusively. Rangers stationed nearby later noted that bear sightings in that particular drainage had roughly tripled over the preceding month, a pattern consistent with the season rather than anything unusual about that specific year. Mason Ellery, 34, worked as a civil engineer, methodical by trade and by nature, the kind of person who planned routes weeks in advance and kept detailed packing lists for every trip. Brooke Hastings, 31, taught elementary school and brought a steadier, more easygoing energy to their partnership, the one who talked Mason into slowing down and enjoying a view instead of pushing to the next mile marker. They'd met through a mutual friend at a climbing gym years earlier and bonded quickly over a shared love of the outdoors, eventually building an entire relationship around weekend trips and longer backcountry excursions whenever their schedules aligned. Most of that experience, though, came from areas with comparatively light bear activity, and I think that's exactly the kind of experience that quietly turns into overconfidence without anyone noticing it happening. You don't get complacent from having no experience at all. You get complacent from having just enough of the wrong kind, built in places that never really tested it. There's a specific pattern in these kinds of cases that I find myself noticing over and over. People who've done a version of something safely many times start to treat that safety as a property of the activity itself rather than a property of the specific conditions they happen to be in. Their 4-day trip put them in a valley during hyperphagia, the fall period when grizzlies spend nearly every waking hour searching for food to build the fat reserves that get them through winter denning. During hyperphagia, a single grizzly can consume upward of 20,000 calories a day, foraging almost continuously from dawn until well after dark in pursuit of berries, roots, and anything else calorie-dense enough to be worth the effort. That's not a small detail buried in the background. That is the single most food-driven, most food-obsessed stretch of a grizzly's entire year, and rangers in that region treat it accordingly, often posting seasonal warnings at trailheads specifically because of it. They prepared dinner well away from the tent, which was the correct call and worth acknowledging as such. They also hung their food bag in a tree roughly 100 yards from camp, following the standard advice for the area. But scent doesn't stay confined to where you leave it. It rides on cookware, on clothing fibers, on the outside surface of a pack, and a grizzly moving through a valley after dark doesn't need much of a trace to get curious enough to investigate further. Grizzlies investigating a campsite are not automatically hunting the people inside it. Most of the time, they're working entirely off smell, checking a location the same way they'd check any other potential food source in their territory. But a grizzly is enormous. Mature males regularly weigh over 700 pounds, and if it gets startled at close range inside a small, collapsed space like a 2-person tent, the raw size difference alone removes almost any real chance of a controlled outcome for the people inside. Heavy footsteps circle the tent sometime after midnight, slow and deliberate at first, the kind of sound that in hindsight was almost certainly the bear working its way around the perimeter of the site before committing to anything. Mason moved for the zipper, trying to get a look outside. Brooke reached for the flashlight beside her. The instant the zipper opened, the bear's head and shoulders drove through the gap, and its jaws closed across Mason's arm and shoulder before he could pull back. Brooke grabbed at the canvas trying to create distance, and the bear released Mason for a moment and turned on her, knocking her flat against the tent wall with a single swipe before both of them sustained the injuries that ultimately killed them, all inside a space barely large enough for 2 people to lie down in. I don't think this particular bear ever set out to hunt them. I think it smelled something worth checking, moved in to investigate the source, and reacted the only way a startled 700-pound animal boxed into a collapsed tent space can react. Officials located the site the following afternoon after the couple failed to check in as scheduled, a search that involved both a ranger team on foot and a search dog trained specifically to track bear activity. A tent zipper was never a real barrier, not against something that size, and it's easy in hindsight to see how thin that line always was. The next couple learned a similar lesson about a different kind of barrier entirely: distance from armed protection in a landscape where that distance is the only thing separating a good photograph from a fatal one. It was April 6th, 2017, and Svalbard sat locked in the strange, flat light of the high Arctic spring, endless drifting sea ice stretching toward the horizon in every direction, the temperature well below freezing even at midday, and a wind carrying a particular cold that works its way through every layer of clothing eventually. Nolan Pierce, 39, worked as a wildlife photographer with more than a decade of published credits behind him, known among colleagues for his patience and his willingness to wait hours in brutal conditions for a single frame. Elise Vaughn, 35, worked as a travel journalist, the writer who paired with Nolan's images on assignment after assignment, and the two had married 3 years earlier after meeting on a shared expedition to Greenland. Nolan and Elise made their living documenting remote destinations, Iceland, Greenland, northern Norway, before signing on for a professionally guided Arctic expedition to Svalbard, specifically to photograph drifting sea ice for an upcoming magazine feature. The mandatory safety briefing they sat through beforehand was not vague or open to interpretation. Nobody walks away from that briefing confused about the central rule: never leave the immediate protection of camp without an armed guide. Full stop. Because polar bears move constantly through that terrain hunting for food, the expedition company reportedly required every guest to sign an acknowledgement of that specific rule before setting foot on the ice. What strikes me about this particular case is how much professional experience they actually had. These weren't first-time travelers overwhelmed by an unfamiliar environment they'd already worked in some of the most remote places on the planet. That makes the decision to step away from camp without telling anyone feel less like ignorance and more like a specific momentary lapse, the kind that experienced people are sometimes more prone to, precisely because they trust their own judgment a little too much in an environment that doesn't forgive that trust. Polar bears are the largest land predators on Earth, and unlike nearly every other bear species, they actively hunt large prey as a routine, ordinary part of their behavior. They are not reacting defensively when they approach a person the way a grizzly might. In the Arctic, a polar bear evaluating a human is running roughly the same calculation it runs toward a seal hauled out on the ice. Guides in the region are trained to recognize the specific, purposeful gait of a bear that has already decided a target is worth pursuing, as opposed to one simply moving across the ice. After returning from a guided excursion, Nolan and Elise decided to walk a short distance from camp to photograph pressure ridges they'd noticed earlier that day, believing they'd only be gone a few minutes. They didn't notify the armed guides before leaving. I understand the impulse completely. The light was probably right. The shot probably felt worth the small risk in that exact moment. But that's precisely the kind of decision that only looks small and reasonable right up until a bear is already less than 70 yards away and closing. A large male polar bear emerged from behind, drifting ice at that distance. It didn't circle or test them the way a more cautious predator might. It moved directly across the ice at a flat run, closing 70 yards in a matter of seconds. There was no firearm between them, no armed escort nearby, and nowhere close enough to retreat to safely. Nolan reportedly tried to put himself between Elise and the bear as it closed the final stretch, but the size and speed difference left neither of them any real chance once the bear made contact. Other members of the expedition eventually located the scene after noticing the couple hadn't returned when expected, a delay of roughly 40 minutes that guides later said was already longer than protocol allowed before triggering a search. Investigators didn't need to reconstruct much of anything. The rule they'd broken was the exact same rule stated plainly in the safety briefing both of them had sat through before the trip even began. A photograph worth a few unsupervised minutes cost them the only real protection that mattered in that particular landscape. From drifting ice fields to a reef drop-off in the warm water of the Bahamas, the next couple didn't ignore a stated rule at all. They simply drifted a little too far from the group, and in the wrong stretch of water, that alone turned out to be enough. It was February 18th, 2022, and the water off a quiet stretch of the Bahamas sat calm and clear under a bright winter sun, the kind of visibility that tends to pull snorkelers farther from the boat than they mean to go. Local dive operators in the area often describe February visibility as some of the best of the year, which is precisely why so many excursions are scheduled for that stretch of the season. Ethan Calloway, 29, worked as a commercial electrician, and Sophie Bennett, 27, worked as a registered nurse, a detail that would matter enormously in the frantic minutes right after the attack, since it was Sophie who normally stayed calm in emergency rather than the other way around. Friends described Ethan as protective almost to a fault, the type who checked in constantly during any trip involving open water, and Sophie as adventurous but grounded, someone who'd traveled extensively before meeting him and had a habit of drifting toward the best photo rather than sticking rigidly to a group. They'd been together 5 years and had traveled to the Bahamas specifically to celebrate their recent engagement, a trip Ethan had planned almost entirely himself as a surprise for her, down to the specific reef he'd researched online months in advance. Both of them could snorkel comfortably, but neither had much time logged in genuinely deep offshore water, the kind where the reef just stops and there's nothing visible underneath except depth. I think it's worth pointing out how ordinary this trip looked, right up until the moment it wasn't. There was no reckless plan here, no ignored warning from a local guide, nothing that reads as obviously careless in hindsight. Sophie simply drifted a little farther than she probably realized while chasing a good shot, and that's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. Sometimes the distance that gets someone killed isn't measured in bad decisions, just in a few unnoticed yards. During the final stop of the guided excursion, Sophie drifted farther from the main group while photographing schools of fish gathering near the edge of that drop-off. Tiger sharks are wide-ranging predators, well known for investigating unfamiliar movement in open water, and a single snorkeler working alone along the edge of deep water is exactly the kind of disturbance that tends to draw one in for a closer look. Tiger sharks in particular are known among researchers for a broader, more opportunistic feeding pattern than many other large shark species, which makes them more likely than most to investigate something unfamiliar rather than avoid it. The shark rose from below without any warning and struck Sophie across the torso and upper leg, the force of the bite alone enough to cause catastrophic blood loss within seconds. Hearing her scream through the water, Ethan swam toward her immediately, against direct instructions from the crew to return to the boat instead. I think most people would have done exactly what he did in that moment. I honestly don't know that I could have turned around and swum the other way either, no matter how sound the instruction was. He grabbed the shark by its dorsal fin and repeatedly struck at its head and gill area, trying to keep it away from her, while the crew closed the distance carrying flotation equipment. Tiger sharks are documented as circling back to investigate a struggling target rather than simply leaving after a single strike, which is precisely what happened next in the water. The shark peeled off, circled roughly 20 feet out, then came back around and closed on Ethan, biting down across his forearm and shoulder before the guides finally managed to drive it off using poles and pull him aboard the boat. Sophie didn't survive long enough for emergency medical help to reach shore. Ethan did, after multiple surgeries and a long stretch of rehabilitation afterward, including a period of physical therapy focused on regaining use of the arm the shark had bitten. The point marine experts kept returning to afterward was blunt and unambiguous. Get out of the water immediately. Don't linger near an injured person in open water. Don't attempt prolonged physical engagement. One reef drop-off, one shark that came back for a deliberate second pass. The next story moves entirely away from water onto open savanna, where the danger wasn't a single animal at all. It was two separate herds moving toward the same shrinking waterhole from two different directions. It was November 11th, 2016. And the dry season had settled hard over the Botswana bush cracked earth, stretching between sparse trees, waterholes thinning by the week, and wildlife concentrating tightly around whatever water still remained anywhere nearby. Guides in the region often describe November as the tensest month of the dry season, the point at which competition over the last remaining waterholes peaks before the rains finally break. Caleb Foster, 42, worked as a structural welder, a steady, physically capable man who friends described as the calmest person they knew in any emergency. Lauren Foster, 40, worked as a physical therapist, warm and detail-oriented, the one who'd planned nearly every trip they'd taken together over 2 decades of marriage. They'd met in their early 20s, married young, and raised 2 children together while still finding time for the kind of ambitious travel most couples put off indefinitely. Botswana had been on Lauren's list for years, and the trip was booked specifically as an anniversary gift to themselves after both kids had moved out for college, the first major trip either of them had taken since becoming empty nesters. There's something particularly painful about this one that I think gets lost if you only focus on the mechanics of the trampling itself. 20 years married, a trip planned specifically to celebrate that, and the entire tragedy comes down to a single stumble on uneven ground. It's a reminder that these situations don't always require a bad decision earlier in the day. Sometimes, the only mistake is bad footing at the worst possible moment, and no amount of prior caution changes what happens next. African bush elephants are the largest land animals alive, with mature bulls weighing up to roughly 13,000 pounds, and herd behavior around other unfamiliar herds isn't always calm, even completely apart from any human presence nearby. When two separate herds cross paths near a shared resource like a waterhole, both groups adjust their movement at essentially the same time, and that mutual adjustment can escalate into something closer to a stampede with very little advance warning to anyone standing nearby. Researchers who study elephant behavior around contested water sources note that even herds with no history of conflict will often break into a run simply in response to the other group's sudden movement, a kind of contagious panic that spreads through dozens of animals almost instantly. While the Fosters were photographing a breeding herd near the water hole, a second herd approached unexpectedly from a different direction entirely. The guides read the shift in body language almost immediately and called for a full, quiet retreat from the area. Lauren stumbled, crossing a stretch of uneven ground partway through that retreat, and went down hard, twisting her ankle underneath her. Caleb turned back toward her instead of continuing on toward nearby cover with everyone else, reaching her just as the first elephants from both converging herds broke into a run less than 30 yards away. He got an arm under her and tried to pull her upright, but neither of them cleared the open ground before the front line of the herd reached them, and both were struck and trampled as dozens of elephants moved through the same stretch of open bush within a matter of seconds. I don't think there's a version of that specific decision that I genuinely criticize, even knowing how it ended. Turning back for the person you love isn't a lapse in judgment in any meaningful sense. It's just not always a survivable choice. The investigation afterward found no evidence of a deliberate charge and no indication the elephants were specifically targeting people at any point. It was simply two large herds reacting naturally to each other's sudden movement in a way that happened, by unfortunate timing, to intersect with two people who had already lost their early lead on the retreat. Uneven ground and a handful of lost seconds decided that entire outcome. The next couple had an experienced guide, a clear and repeated instruction to stay back, and still closed that same exact gap for the exact same underlying reason, because the person they loved was the one suddenly in danger. It was July 23rd, 2019, and the South African bush sat deep in its winter dry season, the grass low, pale, and brittle underfoot, the vegetation unusually dense and tangled in isolated patches, where water had lingered a little longer than usual. Reserve staff later noted that the specific patch of brush involved had grown thicker than usual that year following an unusually wet previous season, creating cover denser than what guides in the area were used to navigating. Grant Holloway, 36, worked in software consulting and had a genuine, long-standing interest in wildlife photography that he'd developed slowly over years of vacation trips. Mira Holloway, 33, was a veterinarian whose professional background pulled her specifically toward observing predators up close in their natural environment, a curiosity that had shaped much of their travel together since they married 4 years earlier. Friends described Mira as fearless, almost to a fault around animals, a trait that made sense given her career, but occasionally worried the people closest to her. And Grant, as more cautious by nature, usually the one holding back rather than pushing forward. It's a small irony that in the moment that mattered most, it was Mira who moved first. After completing a run of successful game drives, they signed on for a walking safari through that same dense bush, a setting where visibility drops fast and a guide's job becomes considerably harder to do well. It's worth noting that walking safaris and game drives are not remotely comparable in terms of risk, even when they cover the same terrain. From a vehicle, you're generally treated by wildlife as a single large, unfamiliar shape that most predators choose to avoid. On foot, that same wildlife sees individual humans, at individual distances, moving in ways that can register as a direct threat. Grant and Mira had done plenty of the former. This was their first real experience with the latter, and the guide leading the walk had reportedly given the standard briefing on single-file spacing and staying quiet through dense cover just minutes before the group entered that stretch of brush. Lions with cubs are among the most predictably defensive animals in the entire African bush, and that defensiveness isn't aggression in the way most people casually picture it. It's a direct, almost reflexive response to feeling cornered or approached too closely while cubs are nearby and vulnerable. In thick vegetation specifically, that threshold gets crossed before anyone walking through it even realizes it's happened. The group moved through dense brush and came within roughly 15 feet of a lioness, resting with partially concealed older cubs nearby before any single person in the group actually spotted her. Feeling threatened at that range, she came up in a low charge, covering the distance in under 2 seconds, and seized Grant by the shoulder, driving him to the ground with the initial impact alone. Mira ran toward him. The guide gave repeated, urgent commands to stay back, and she didn't listen to any of them. I think that's genuinely the hardest single moment in this entire story to sit with. I understand completely why she ran toward him without hesitation, and I also understand with total clarity why doing so made an already catastrophic situation measurably worse. The lioness released Grant, turned and closed on Mira within a few strides, biting down across her chest and neck before shifting her attention back to Grant, who was still on the ground and unable to get clear. Armed rangers eventually arrived and secured the area, but both Grant and Mira had already sustained fatal injuries by that point. Wildlife authorities were unambiguous afterward that this had never been a predatory attack in any sense, it was a defensive one, triggered because the group had unknowingly entered space. The lioness considered an immediate threat to her cubs. Thick bush hid the danger completely until it was already too close to avoid safely. The next story doesn't involve size, speed, or visible teeth at all. Just a branch on a hiking trail that wasn't actually a branch, and a decision to badly underestimate what a small, unremarkable-looking snake could actually do to a person. It was January 14th, 2015, and rural South Africa sat in the full, dry heat of midsummer. The hiking trails around a remote escarpment, dry and heavily overgrown, thick with exactly the kind of dense shrub cover that swallows fine detail at a passing glance. The trail they'd chosen wasn't a heavily trafficked one, which was part of its appeal to two travelers who'd spent months seeking out routes fewer tourists bothered with. Owen Carter, 30, worked as a mining equipment mechanic, practical and unbothered by discomfort, the type of traveler who packed light and never seemed fazed by rough conditions. Hannah Doyle, 28, worked as a landscape architect, drawn to remote, undeveloped places partly for professional inspiration and partly out of genuine love for wild terrain. They'd been together 2 years, having met while both were living abroad, and this trip through rural South Africa was part of a longer, loosely planned journey across the region, the kind of open-ended travel neither of them had been able to take before settling into their careers. Friends described them as easygoing to a fault, rarely rattled by setbacks, which likely explains why 2 venomous bites got treated with less urgency than the situation actually demanded. Before sunrise on January 14th, they set out toward an isolated escarpment known specifically for its panoramic views, pushing steadily through dense shrubs along a narrow section of the trail. Owen brushed his hand against what looked, at a glance, like a thin branch hanging loosely across the path ahead. It wasn't a branch at all. It was an African twig snake, camouflaged well enough against the surrounding brush to be functionally invisible even at close range, and it struck the back of his hand, holding on and chewing briefly at the wound in the slow, deliberate way rear-fanged venomous snakes typically deliver venom before releasing and disappearing back into the vegetation around them. What makes this species so uniquely dangerous, in my opinion, isn't just the camouflage or the delayed symptoms, it's how thoroughly it defies what most people expect a dangerous snake to look like. There's no hood, no rattle, no obvious warning display of any kind. It looks like exactly what it's pretending to be, right up until it isn't. Herpetologists who study the species have noted that its coloring alone accounts for most confirmed bites, since almost nobody who's bitten reports seeing anything that registered as a snake in the moment beforehand. Hannah, believing the snake was likely still close by somewhere in the brush, used her hiking pole to carefully move the branches aside and was bitten across 2 fingers as well before it finally retreated for good. Twig snake bites notably don't come with dramatic pain or obvious swelling right away, which is exactly what makes this particular species so genuinely dangerous. The venom works as a slow-acting hemotoxin that steadily disrupts the body's normal blood clotting process, and that total lack of immediate, obvious symptoms tends to convince bitten people they're fine when they're really not. That's exactly what happened here. Instead of treating both bites as a genuine medical emergency and requesting immediate evacuation, Owen and Hannah made the decision to start driving several hours toward the nearest hospital under their own power. During that long drive, both of them gradually developed uncontrolled bleeding from the gums and bite sites, along with the internal signs of steadily worsening hemorrhage. By the time physicians at the rural hospital connected their specific symptoms to the description of a slender, branch-colored snake, no antivenom for that particular species was available on site, and subsequent attempts to transfer both patients to a larger, better-equipped medical center ultimately came too late to make a real difference. Owen Carter and Hannah Doyle died from severe internal bleeding caused by a bite that never looked remotely serious until it already was.